If you're watching this video, odds are you love Shrek. Or you fell asleep with YouTube's autoplay still on. And since Shrek is life, I figured why not take a look at the entire timeline of the franchise. Bet you didn't know that you needed that in your life, and yet, here we are.
Well, then what are you waiting for?
You probably think that the first entry in a timeline of Shrek films would naturally be the first Shrek movie. Well, in a surprise to basically everybody, the first piece of media chronologically is actually a television show entitled The Adventures of Puss in Boots. The series followed the adventures of the swashbuckling, smooth-talking kitty as he attempted to protect the town of San Lorenzo from all sorts of treacherous baddies. The series even tied into an interactive special that Netflix put together in partnership with DreamWorks called Puss in Book: Trapped in an Epic Tale, which honestly was pretty weird, but it was still technically canon, so I guess it counts. Although the show ended with a bit of a reset to the timeline, so I guess the canonicity is actually questionable, but still thought it was worth mentioning here. After this on the timeline was, once again, not Shrek. It was actually more Puss in Boots.
Wait, hear me out, okay?
This time, the first spin-off film, the aptly titled Puss in Boots, slots in about here. Don't worry, we'll get to the big green guy soon, I promise. This movie gives us more of the early days of Puss in Boots, including his relationship with Humpty Dumpty and Kitty Softpaws. Naturally, shenanigans ensued, giving us effectively a heist movie version of Jack and the Beanstalk, one that takes some serious liberties with the original fables, as one would expect from a movie connected to the Shrek franchise. And on top of all that, it was actually a pretty decent movie, all things considered. Not as good as the sequel, but we'll get to that later. After this chronologically comes Puss in Boots: The Three Diablos. Out of all of the pre-Shrek pieces, this one probably has the least impact on things moving forward, but I thought that I should mention it.
Really?
If for no other reason than to give you some footage of adorable animated kittens. I mean, just look at those big animated doe eyes. Don't they just make you want to hug them and squeeze them and subscribe to the channel? No? Well, maybe you should do it anyways. I'm sure the kittens would really appreciate it. Anyways, now it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for. Cue the Smash Mouth. What do you mean we don't have enough money to license Smash Mouth? Alright, fine, it's the first Shrek movie. This film introduced us to the giant green ball of fury that is the ogre Shrek, and followed him as he went on a journey to try to get a bunch of displaced magical creatures out of the swamp that he called home. To do this, he was tasked by Lord Farquaad, this guy who looks suspiciously like former Disney CEO Michael Eisner, with trying to rescue a princess from a tower that was guarded by a fearsome dragon. Along the way, he met up with Donkey, his plucky comic relief sidekick, who actually wound up romancing the dragon instead of fighting it, because that's funnier. Totally wouldn't then become like a defining character trait for Donkey or anything like that. The princess they were saving turned out to be Princess Fiona of the Kingdom of Far, Far Away. Naturally, Fiona and Shrek hit it off, though initially this love was complicated by the fact that Fiona was a human, while Shrek was an ogre. However, near the end we find out that Fiona was actually kind of an ogre. She was cursed as a baby, and this curse caused her to become an ogre at night. But by the climax of the film, she was one full time after kissing Shrek. The two got married and proceeded to live happily ever after in Shrek Swamp, surrounded by his friends. Until Shrek 2, that is. Actually, we have a couple of things to talk about before Shrek 2. First, there was this weird, karaoke short film that took place at their wedding reception that honestly is just really weird. And then there was Shrek 4D, the ride at Universal Studios that, had some stuff happen in it. I'm not gonna get into it, just know that it kind of fits here.
You were saying?
Anyway, Shrek 2. This movie is probably the most important in the entire franchise, at least in terms of expanding the lore and the world building of the IP. The plot is fairly simple. Basically, Fiona's parents, the king and queen of Far, Far Away, learned that Fiona had finally married her true love, and thus they invited the pair, who were joined by Donkey for some reason, to visit them at her childhood home. As expected, they weren't exactly thrilled about the fact that Shrek was an ogre and that their daughter was now one full-time. Kinda caused some friction. Shrek wound up getting a hold of a potion created by the fairy godmother, the main antagonist of this movie, that turned him and Fiona into humans. Something that Prince Charming, the fairy godmother's son, took advantage of. tricking Fiona into thinking that he was the human form of Shrek. Naturally, Shrek had to swoop in to save the day, along the way running into more famous creatures from fables, including Puss in Boots, who finally stepped in to round out the main trio for the remaining group of movies. Shrek and Fiona were soon returned to their natural forms, and her parents finally accepted Shrek as a proper son-in-law. Oh, and we also then found out that Dragon and Donkey had some kids. Some weird dragon-donkey hybrid kids. Okay, moving on. Next up was Far, Far Away Idol, a short film parodying American Idol. It's just okay.
Only a true friend would be that truly honest.
Now on to Shrek the Third. In this movie, Shrek and Fiona were once again summoned to Far, Far Away, though this time for much more somber reasons. Fiona's father, King Harold, was actually on his deathbed. Thus, the pair had to step up and take over as king and queen of Far, Far away. This was something that Shrek was not particularly thrilled about, arguing that ogres aren't exactly meant for that royal life. So Harold wound up telling Shrek about another possible heir, Artie, Fiona's cousin. And thus Shrek, along with Donkey and Puss in Boots, set out to try to find Artie to bring him back to the castle in order to make him king. Meanwhile, Charming, still reeling after getting his butt whooped and his mama taken out at the end of the last movie, gathered together a band of outcasts and brigands, all to try to take power by force. Eventually, Shrek and the gang came to blows with Charming and his forces. Though in the end, Artie stepped up and convinced the outcasts to instead side with him and the people of Far, Far Away. Therefore, Charming was once again defeated. Artie took his place as king of Far, Far Away. And during the movie, we also learned that Fiona was actually pregnant. Ta-da! By the end, she had given birth to 3 little tiny ogre babies. 3 little ogre babies living in a swamp with their parents, a cat, a donkey, a dragon, and some weird hybrid monstrosities. Awesome. Then there was a Christmas special. It exists, that's really all I have to say about it. Now let's move on to Shrek Forever After. This movie once again saw Shrek and his family and friends drawn into some drama involving Far, Far Away. In this case, it all centered around Rumpelstiltskin, who had apparently nearly gotten control of the kingdom in exchange for lifting Fiona's curse prior to the first movie. With the deal having fallen through because, Shrek kind of broke the curse, Rumple was of course pretty miffed. And he hatched a plan to take revenge on Shrek, who of course was responsible for the curse having been lifted and thus Rumple not getting what he wanted. He tricked Shrek into changing time, making it so that he had never even been born, which caused a sort of Back to the Future style split timeline. And things were pretty dark in this alternate reality. Fiona was still cursed and actually leading an army of ogres in an uprising against Rumple, who had successfully taken over Far, Far Away in Shrek's absence. Oh, and Puss in Boots was overweight and really not able to do anything other than just sit around and be lazy. Shrek found out that in order to return things back to normal, he had to once again obtain True Love's kiss, which meant attempting to woo a now battle-hardened, no-nonsense version of Fiona, which was a pretty tall order. She's fighting a war, for God's sakes. But you know how this kind of stuff goes. Shrek managed to melt her cold heart, and at the last possible moment, he got the kiss, restoring the timeline to the way it was meant to be all along, which actually brought an end to the mainline Shrek movies. As of the recording of this video, Shrek Forever After is the last film starring the ogre Shrek, but it's not the last one in the franchise. In December 2022, we got the release of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, a spin-off and sequel to the original Puss in Boots.
It's a surprise party, and the surprise is on you.
This movie told a much more existential and honestly pretty dark tale. Puss in Boots found himself on the final one of his 9 lives, and spends the entire runtime coming to grips with his own mortality. Heck, at one point even facing down death himself in the guise of a wolf in a cloak. It's an extremely heartfelt and exceptionally well-written film, in addition to just being a ton of fun. So while yes, we've been hearing rumors of a possible 5th Shrek film for years at this point, if The Last Wish winds up being the last film in the franchise, I can't honestly think of a better film to go out on. That film is a prime example of something that I've been saying for years. Just because a movie is a kid's movie doesn't mean it should be cheap or stupid. Pixar is also another great example of that. Yes, I would argue that Last Wish is kinda on that level. Go watch it.